Good afternoon, everybody. This research that I'm going to be talking about for the next 10 minutes is part of a PhD that I'm doing at the University of Central Lancashire, and I do want to just pay tribute to Mary Welsh, who spoke this morning, who's my supervisor, who's guided me so far. I'm 2 years into a part-time PhD, only 4 years to go. I'm talking about measurement, the measurement of internal communication. That's the topic of my PhD thesis. And so I'm going to just talk to you what I did for my research. So I have looked at a number of studies, both academic and practitioner. Studies that are looking at how internal communication is measured and also revealing some of the results from those measurements of internal communication. What I find is there are two things I think that I want to make. There's 2 points that I want to make, really. And they are, the first point is that the way that we measure internal communication is outdated. We're using old measurement tools. And the second point is that we are not using contemporary PR theory to inform the way that we measure internal communication. So these are two fundamental problems that we face as a profession. If we are a profession, Steve, yeah, and I think we're on the way. So I think we're getting there. But as academics have already recognised, and as we've already seen this morning, theory building in internal communication is still not there. So I want to talk a little bit as well about where I think theory can go. But before I do that, and before I reveal to you in the next slide what the state of internal communication is from the studies that I looked at, I wanted to ask you, first of all, what you think. So I looked at these 12 studies, and although studies use different questions, some of them, or a lot of them, asked a question about, are you satisfied with the information you received as an employee? What do you think the level of satisfaction is with the information provided? Someone give me a figure. 10. 10%. Yes. 0. Wow.
You have the full range.
Okay. 10 and 0. No, those of us who work in internal communication, surely, we would expect a little bit of a higher figure. So anyone want to give me a 50? Thanks, John. Any more? Any more? Okay, right. Well, actually, the figure ranges between 53 and 64%. Well, John, you get today's prize. But the problem is in all of this, no one's really asking employees what they want in terms of content. We seem to be focused on channels and volume of information, as if that is what internal communication is. Well, I think quite rightly, the president of Slovenia had his finger on the pulse straight away this morning. It's not about information, it's about understanding. Okay, so we need to know about the content, don't we? We need to ask employees what it is they want internal communication to be about. And guess what? There was one study that I found where someone actually said to employees, what sort of things do you want the organisation to talk to you about? Okay, this was by Hagi and Turish in 2009. And guess what the number one thing was the employees said? How problems that I report in my job are dealt with. And guess what the number 4 was? Things that go wrong in my organisation. Well, there's a challenge for us, isn't it, as practitioners? How many internal comms newsletters do you see that report objectively about things that are going wrong? It's pretty rare in my experience. Okay. And that, by the way, understanding is not too bad at 60%, but it gets undermined completely by senior manager clarity. And do you know what? Senior manager walking the talk, or the ability of consistency in behaviour, goes down to 30%. So, there's a key message for us. We are obsessed with doing stuff as internal comms practitioners. We do newsletters, we do newspapers, we do events, and absolutely nothing wrong with that, of course. But that tends to dictate what we measure. So we measure how many newsletters that are out there. We tend to measure whether or not people are getting newsletters or whether they like newsletters or not. And we seem to be obsessed with the process of internal communication rather than the understanding that is created or not from it. And this is a problem. Now, before I talk about how we can deal with this, I want to touch on some theory. In my analysis to date, it seems to me that there are some weaknesses in the application of communication, PR theory and medium theory that are missing from internal communications. First of all, when it comes to communication theory, it seems that internal communication practice is dominated by a transmission one-way model. I think we've already heard that. And to my main point, there is very, very little attention paid to the links to employee engagement, which have already been touched on. When it comes to PR theory, there are very few papers out there that adapt or attempt to adapt critical or rhetorical theory in PR to internal communication. In fact, if you're interested in this topic of critical theory applied to internal communication, there is an academic in the US called Stanley Dietz who works in an organisational communication perspective, who takes a critical eye of internal communication, but it's very few and far between in my experience. And finally, when it comes to medium theory, no one's really looking at whether or not the channel used for internal communication is appropriate, as Mary was talking about this morning. And finally, social media theory, if it exists at all, but the thinking behind social media is rarely applied, if at all, to internal communication. So that's the theoretical bit. I like a piece of research that was done in 2006 by Professor Truss in the UK, and her findings were that when it comes to employee engagement, there are three key drivers. Two of them are listed here. One on the right, how well informed am I? And the second one, do I have a voice? There was a third one, which is how committed is my line manager to the organisation? But I pick out these two. How well informed am I? Do I have a voice? And then I kind of think about, well, how do we apply those from an internal communication perspective? Well, first of all, we have to look at how well informed am I as an individual? What's my role about? Or how well informed am I in terms of my performance in the organisation? And then secondly, do I have a voice? So do I have a voice with my line manager, or do I have a voice that goes up the organisation? So that's where I think we've got to direct our thinking when it comes to developing internal communication theory that is linked directly to employee engagement. Now, how does that translate then into some sort of questions that we might use as a conceptual model for developing some measurement around internal communication? And if we measure these dimensions, they will give us a good indication of whether or not we're going to get employee engagement. And by the way, we ought to be doing this because Professor Truss found that only 35% of people are engaged. So it's a serious problem. So I've got developed here a set of questions that we could be using as a framework for a new model for measuring internal communication in a way that the responses will tell us whether or not we are going to have employee engagement as an outcome. I'm not going to read through them all there for you. They're in the paper, but the key point here is that this model incorporates both a line management perspective on communication and a perspective that links to the organisation. I mean, some interesting research now that by Visecki in 2009, who found that organisational identification, so how far do I as an individual identify with my organisation, is a more powerful driver for employee engagement than performance or individual role management perspectives. So that's what we've got to focus on. So the model here is meant to represent a balance between line manager communication and organisational level. And finally, to finish off here, we need to think about this thing called social media that internal comms people are still trying to get their head around. And it seems to me that we're already falling into the same trap that we've been in for the past 15 or 20 years when it comes to measurement. The way we measure social media is just the same way as we've been measuring things in the past, and we've got to adopt a new model. Thank you very much.